Okay, hello everyone, Simon Jacobson here. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Meaningful Live, our Sunday afternoon Eastern Time program, every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We're now, in the last few months, we've been doing our Bible series, we call it. Essentially, personal, psychological, and emotional applications from the greatest bestseller and most largest selling book ever, the Bible. The narratives, the characters, the personalities, and applying it to our personal lives. So everybody knows the story of Exodus. Everybody knows the story of the 10 plagues, which sometimes evokes a little laughter and chuckles when people sit at the Seder table or when they read about it. When you read about the blood, the frogs, the lice, and all the 10 plagues that the Egyptians who enslaved the Jewish people were struck with. And ultimately, the final plague of the killing of the firstborn, which was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, and Pharaoh and the Egyptians finally released the Jewish people. But what is lesser known is a fascinating and powerful and personal, intimate application of these 10 plagues as seen as 10, you can call them psychological plagues. 10 challenges and corrupt, toxic forces that each of us has to be careful of in our own personal lives as we try to grow. Because you see, when you take the entire story and you look at the more mystical, I like to call the psycho-spiritual dimension of it, it takes on a very different meaning. The word for Egypt in Hebrew, Mitzrayim, as you may know, means constraints. It means inhibitions, fears, insecurities, neurosis. Every possible psychological voice or force that inhibits us, that limits our ability to express ourselves, whether it's fear, insecurity, whether it's real or imagined, the different traumas we've experienced all go under the rubric of Mitzrayim, of Meitzar, which means limitation, boundaries, constraints, dire straits, if you wish. And the story in the Bible, when you look at it from that perspective, the spiritual, psychological perspective, is the story of our inhibitions, of our fears, of our insecurities, whatever form they take. And therefore, we sometimes can be our own worst enemy. Because it's one thing when you can identify and contain the problem, it's another when the problem begins to fester, begins to expand. Like you think of an infection. If you nip it in the bud, it can be resolved. But when you allow it to get out of control, it becomes a monster. So when we're dealing with our own challenges, whatever they may be, we want to make sure that we don't make the problem worse. The plagues that the Egyptians were struck with represents in each one of our lives. For example, a person, let's say, makes a mistake and they do something wrong. Very often what we'll do, one mistake leads to another mistake. We lie. Because we lie, we then cover it up with another lie. We get stuck and we do something that is inappropriate. And then often we continue the process and to the point we become addicted to it. The plagues are really not some type of curse or punishment. It's actually cause and effect. That when you deal with the challenges of your life, you don't want to bring upon yourself what is called in the Bible plagues, but really they're called psychological, emotional mistakes that we make in different parts of our psyche. And the plagues are meant to wake us up and be aware of the problem that we ourselves can create in that sense. So when you think of it that way, it's actually a wake-up call. It's actually almost like saying 10 different nerve points that cause us pain, that remind us of things that we shouldn't be doing, and also what we should be doing. So I'm going to go through these 10 briefly. I've discussed it over the years more at length, different programs, different workshops. But let's do the brief version here. And hopefully, if you're interested, you can always look for more information on any of these ideas that I will be sharing. But what's most important to remember is that we cannot control circumstance around us, but we sure can control how we address it. And I will say this without hesitation. Most problems, the biggest problems, the problem itself could have been contained. They get much worse when we allow the plagues to begin to emerge, when we allow these plagues that we bring upon ourselves to cause more damage than necessary. So we're not here to talk about damage, we're here to talk about a wake-up call, to talk about identifying mistakes that we make and to avoid doing them. So in a sense, the 10 plagues also have 10 blessings, because if you can counteract it and bring the positive force behind each one of them, then you build yourself a healthier life. So we're titling this program, we're titling it Blood, Frogs, Lice, the Kabbalah of the 10 Plagues, and it is dedicated in loving memory of Tzvi and Iti Ainsworth, with much love, Shmuli. So, the number 10, let's start with that. 10 reminds us of other numbers of 10. For example, the 10 Commandments, which actually will follow later in this book of Exodus. We'll read about the 10 Commandments, and they indeed are a tikkun, a type of repair of these 10 plagues, of these 10 negative personality characteristics, you can say, that Mitzrayim symbolizes. 10 negative forms of inhibitions and fears, 10 characteristics that have to be addressed, and then we can correct and repair them through the 10 Commandments. So, with that 10, the 10 come down to the 10 spheres. Everything originates with the 10 spheres. The 10 spheres are the 10 building blocks. Think of it like the DNA of all of existence, including us as human beings. We have 10 faculties that evolve from the 10 spiritual attributes, divine attributes. And they break into two categories. We're talking on a conscious level, two categories: 3 cognitive faculties and 7 emotional ones. And it's critical that we have our mind and our heart in the right place. Our cognitive, our minds and our emotions in the right place in order to deal with any issue. If we lose our minds or our minds get distorted, the same thing with our emotions, that in turn causes more problems. Again, a problem may happen. You need to be very sound, sober, objective, because problems usually elicit all kinds of subjective reactions, and you want to make sure that your emotional reactions are also healthy. And when they're not, they turn into 10 plagues. But let's also address one more level called the superconscious, the things that go on behind the scenes, what is sometimes referred to subconscious or unconscious. But in Kabbalistic terminology, superconscious is a more accurate description of it, because it's supra, it's not beneath, it's above consciousness. So in this concept called inhibitions, fears, addictions, insecurities, and all the other words, other synonyms I used and many others, we are going to now address these elements here. And they begin in the order. If you remember the Seder, the Passover Seder, you know that there are 10. They have the acronym Datzach Adash Ba'achav, and listed they are Dam Tzvardeya Kinim, translated as blood, frogs, lice. The second is Adash, Orev, Dever, Shchin, which is wild beasts, an epidemic, and boils. Ba'achav, the last 4, is Barad, Arba, Choshech, Makas, B'choros. The Barad is the hail, locusts, darkness, and the firstborn. And these 10, the Kabbalists explain, refer to 10 spiritual, psychological, emotional plagues that each of us need to contend with in any Mitzrayim situation we are in. And I'm going to go from the top, which really begins, actually in the 10 spheres, begins from the bottom, from the 7 emotions. And we work our way up, the emotional structure and spectrum, all the way to the cognitive, all the way to the superconscious. That's the order. And that's indeed what happened in the biblical story, that first you try to deal with things on the lowest level. If that doesn't work, you go deeper. And you go deeper and deeper, all the way up to the top. Now, I should also add, in the emotional 7 emotions that I mentioned, the 3 cognitive and the 7 emotions, the 7 emotions break into 2 categories: emotional and behavioral. So behavioral really means how emotions come into actionable level. And emotions are the actual feelings we carry. Without going into elaborate detail, see them as 2 categories. So we go backwards. We start from the bottom. The first plague was the striking of the river Nile that turned into blood. The reason for that was the river Nile was the god of Egypt. Rains rarely fall in Egypt, so they don't look up to heaven. They depend on the irrigation that comes from the river Nile's tides. As the tide came in, it would irrigate their fields. So for Egypt symbolized in that sense, as Pharaoh tells Moses in the Bible, I don't need a god. My God is the river Nile. We are self-made individuals. So the first plague that struck them was in your God, the thing you worship most. And what does blood represent? On a positive level, blood represents the very fluid of life. What happens when the fluid of life becomes something that you become so self-contained that you feel you need nothing, you feel you're the source of your own life? That's when water becomes blood, to demonstrate that your own God cannot protect you. And this is essentially the negative element of blood, where life becomes that you feel you're a self-made individual. Instead of recognizing that life is a gift, you feel you worship yourself. Pharaoh considers himself a god. This, we all know, is the first problem of all problems. It's called arrogance. The antithesis of bittul, arrogance. Bittul is humility, is a sense of devotion and dedication to something greater than yourself. And so blood, on one hand, is a positive, it's the source of life, but when you recognize that it's a source of life and not that you're the source of life. So arrogance is the antithesis of water. Water represents a form of humility, a form of bittul, recognizing that there's something greater than you are. And it's interesting, Moses was called the one who was drawn from water, and the first plague is water turning into blood, demonstrating what arrogance can do, that the very water that's supposed to sustain you becomes blood. And we know blood on one hand is the source of life, but blood is also a symbol of death. Arrogance is a mini death. It is the death of your true full sense of self, because you don't recognize that that there's something greater than you are. And in every given problem that we encounter in life, the first thing is we have to get rid of the arrogance, the pride, where you think you're right. So many times what we do is we start justifying any mistake. We think we're right. You need humility. That's plague number 1, avoiding arrogance. The second one is we move to frogs. Frogs are cold-blooded creatures, and they represent in the Kabbalah, in the spheres. If the first one is about the very dignity of humility and life, which is Malchut, the second one is Yesod, reflects intimacy. Now, intimacy is critical in life. It's called bonding. But bonding can be done in a healthy way, which is a warm and passionate form, or it can be done cold-blooded. A cold-blooded intimacy means it's technical. It doesn't have the vitality and the warmth necessary. So frogs represent the antithesis of healthy intimacy, which means that you start acting out in ways that are, again, selfish, but all in the context of your relationships with others. People who know how to bond with someone. So when you're in need and you feel something's going wrong, you bond with someone, you connect with them, and seek help. But when you're a self-contained individual and your so-called your intimacies are cold and detached, what do you think will happen? You will not reach out to someone else, whether it's to a mentor or to a friend. So frogs is the opposite of that. And of course, the way to prepare that is to be open to listening to advice, to speaking to another person and bonding with another, especially a mentor that can give you objective perspective that you wouldn't have on your own. So that's the second plague. The third, going the next sphere going upward after Yesod is Hod. Hod is literally can mean many different things, But hod is a form of yielding, of acknowledgement. It comes from the word moda ani, I acknowledge, I yield. Now, when a person is in a healthy form of yielding, then they're able to get beyond their own self-contained picture. So you see here that all these three, the first three that I just described, all are focusing just different angles on your ability to really recognize there's something greater than you. They're all in the category of bittul, but different aspects of it. One is affecting the very sense of self. The second is around intimacy, bonding, and connecting. And now it's the very concept of being able to acknowledge, to be able to yield. So take a situation where spouses are in a disagreement and they get locked into their position and a person is obstinate. That's the opposite of hod. So this third plague is about being able to yield and acknowledge, whether it's dealing with another person that you've wronged, or let's say even both are not completely right, but the ability to acknowledge, to be able to transcend your own perspective and take it to another level. Going backwards, we go to the next group. The next group is the wild animals, represents netzach. A wild animal is an aggressive creature. Netzach is ambition, determination, drive. Now here too, there's a positive side, there's a negative side. The negative side is when you step on other people. When your drive is without any form of measure, and it's me, and I'm going to do whatever I have to do. It's basically raw, untamed ambition. The positive side, ambition is important. It's a drive, but it has to be measured. It has to be balanced. You can't just have a wild animal. You need to tame, you need to harness, you need to direct and guide that drive. Very often people who've gotten addicted, or they have other issues they're dealing with, other dimensions of Mitzrayim that they're dealing with, their challenge is they have very strong will, but instead of it going in the right direction, a will that is tempered by the humility of hod, the acknowledgement, their drive is that they become convinced, and they convince themselves that I'm right. So their driving ambition and determination actually is working against them. The determination should be, use your determination to go get healing, to go recover, to fight, to get rid of this problem. But instead, their determination is, I'm going to make it no matter what. You often find this with people who will need to take medication, let's say for bipolar or for other medical situations, and their pride says, no, I don't need it, I can do it myself. Their determination works against them. So that's netzach, the determination that can work against you, determination that can be directed in the proper fashion. The next, from there we go to we said the next is Arav Dever, Tatzach Adash Dever, which in Hebrew is translated epidemic. And now we're talking about Tiferes. We're getting now into the four that I just described are more behavioral. Now we get into the emotional. The emotional with the behavioral within the emotional, and now we're talking about the emotional within the emotional. And there are three here: compassion, Tiferet, then discipline, which is going to be gvura, and love and kindness, which is going to be chesed. That's the next order of the three. So, when we talk about compassion, now we all know the crime of compassion. Sometimes you're compassionate, and it's used again in the wrong way. You're compassionate to the wrong person. What did Winston Churchill say? That appeasement in a time of war is basically feeding the crocodiles in the hope you'll be eaten last. Another expression that's used is compassion to the cruel. You end up being cruel. When you're compassionate to the cruel people, you end up being cruel to compassionate people. Because compassion is a beautiful virtue, one of the most beautiful virtues of all. However, it needs to be placed directly in the right place. The Nazis, they were very compassionate to pets, to dogs and cats, but look how they treated men, women, and children that they decided were vermin. That's a misplaced compassion. It's a compassion that's lacking humility. So that is the next one, that when you have compassion, I've seen situations where people who are dealing with difficulty, they're very compassionate to certain people, many times strangers. And I say, why are you so compassionate as a stranger? You're not compassionate to your own family. Your children need you. Your spouse needs you. Your friends need you. And the compassion is suddenly going to other places. Whatever the reason may be, is it escapism? Is it a way of some cleaning your conscience? But compassion needs most is the people that need you. I know an individual who's a great person, but unfortunately got themselves stuck with alcohol, what we call an alcoholic. Very compassionate person to those that are not close to him. As soon as you get too close, someone's close, you don't see much compassion. So compassion too can be done in a plague way, it can be in a positive way. When you have compassion in a positive way, then there's no doubt that you can use it in a very powerful, that can actually help you. But it needs to be placed in the right place. That is compassion that corresponds with epidemic. Then comes boils. Gvura. Gvura is discipline. Now we all know that discipline, used the wrong way, discipline can become a source of pain, hurting others, too much discipline. When discipline is not measured and balanced with love, people are very disciplinarian, they end up hurting, demoralizing someone, humiliating someone, all in the name of discipline. You can imagine, I'm sure, that the Egyptians used discipline to keep the Jews in check who were they're enslaved by them. But that's a discipline that's an unhealthy one. So in this context, when you're in a situation where you're dealing with your constraints of Mitzrayim, your inhibitions, your fears, and so on, what you want to make sure as well is that the discipline is well placed. Just like with compassion, it's not misdirected. It should be used together with the next one that we're going to talk about, which is love and kindness, which is the hail. Hail, love and kindness, without discipline is as bad as discipline without love and kindness. You need both. Hail is frozen water. Water is kindness, represents chesed, but when it gets frozen love, think of it that way, then it becomes very similar to what we spoke about before with the frogs, frozen or cold, into cold-blooded intimacy. But here we're talking on the emotional level, not just on behavioral level. On the emotional level, the idea that you have kindness, but you kill someone with kindness if it's not properly balanced, not properly regulated. So chesed and gvura, or you can say kindness, love, and discipline go hand in hand. It's the gas and the brakes. Think of rain. When rain falls, it's a perfect combination. If rain would come down in buckets, like a deluge, a flood, it would destroy the fields just like a famine would. On the other hand, no rain at all obviously does not nurture, does not nourish, does not irrigate. So you need the rain, but it needs to come down in raindrops so it can be absorbed by the ground. In relationships, one of the first places you see dysfunctionality, which by the way is another word for Mitzrayim, dysfunctionality, is when you see either a love without proper measure, without raindrops, too much love, or you see the opposite, too little love and too much aggression. What you need is a perfect balance of the two. And both are a plague if they are not balanced properly. They both will ultimately be destructive. Yes, love can be destructive. You see it in relationships where a person has love without boundaries. So it may look beautiful. They're there, but you need boundaries. You need space in a relationship as well. Both parties do. Dysfunctionality is sometimes expressed with too much love or with too much the opposite of love, lack of love. And both are equally problematic. On the other hand, when you repair them, they both balance each other. Okay, so now we come to the last three. The last three are in some ways the deepest ones because they're now going into the very part of our so-called objective tools. This is the cognitive. And the cognitive break into Chochmah, Bina, Das usually, which is conception, understanding, and internalization on the cognitive level. But here, we don't count Das. We count Keser, Chochmah, Bina in Hebrew, going backwards, Bina, which is understand comprehension, conception, and then superconsciousness, Keser. And the last three are locust, darkness, and the firstborn, the death of the firstborn. The most critical component when a person is dealing with any form of dysfunctionality or emotional stress or duress, or all the other things I described before as Mitzrayim, and you can fill the blanks as you see fit. The most important thing is getting an objective perspective. Because your subjectivity becomes your trap. You convince yourself of things that are not real. You go into denial. You minimize. You exaggerate. Because that's the way the human being works. Our emotional subjectivity makes us subjective, and we can't see clearly. That's why it was so important that I discussed earlier the mentor that you need, the friend that you need, the bonding that you need. But on the cognitive level, what you really want is you should come to a level of objectivity with advice of others. That's why we need someone. Like the rule goes, you cannot solve a problem from the same place where the problem was created. It simply means because you're subjective. And when you're subjective, you can't see clearly. So these last three are critical because they create the ultimate clarity. And we all know awareness is half the cure of a problem. Awareness. So till now we've been discussing our emotional reactions, our behavioral reactions. And now we come to the cognitive. And the first step is comprehension, understanding the situation. And very hard to do this on your own, so you need another. What's the plague of comprehension is when you think you're too smart. You understand things so well. The smarter the person, the better they cover their tracks. Where you can't even say, they even give you a case to explain to you that they're not subjective. In the words of the Baal Shem Tov, the darkness is so deep that it conceals the darkness, and you convince yourself, I have no problem. There's no Mitzrayim. There are no constraints. There's no dysfunctionality. There's no addiction. I'm in control. So suddenly your mind becomes your enemy. Because the mind has now become trapped by your subjective emotions, which is trapped by whatever the addiction or whatever it is that's blinding you. And you understand, you understand it all. That's the plague of comprehension. And like locusts, they completely consume everything. As I said, the smarter the person, the better they cover their tracks. What's the antithesis? To listen. To use some of the other skills that we discussed, to listen, to open yourself. No, maybe you don't know it all. Maybe there is another perspective. And to allow yourself open to hear that. Then comes Chokhmah. The ninth plague, darkness. Here, it's not just comprehension, it's the very conception of how we conceive of an idea. It's one thing you conceive of an idea and then later you go off track. But if your conception gets corrupted, which is the plague of this ninth plague, then your very core of the truth is not there. Chachma versus Bina, Chachma is the sense of a higher truth. Bina is understanding it. The sense of a higher truth is sometimes our last refuge on the conscious level. Because what allows us is to go back to the point of departure. How was I like before I became dysfunctional? How was I like before I became inhibited or constrained? Before my fears, when I was a young child. That's going back to the point of conception to Chachma. Now the corruption of Chachma is when that also becomes darkened. Total darkness. To the point that it's a darkness that conceals the darkness, as I mentioned. And the healthy form of Chachma is you go back and you're able to retrace the steps and maybe with the help of others, reconnect to that point of conception. And finally, and this was the final one, that was the one that was necessary to conclude the entire loop, and that was Keser, the firstborn. The firstborn is the superconscious. This precedes even conception. This is a superconscious that goes beyond our memories. Conception, everything we spoke about, you can still say is conscious. Behavioral conscious, consciousness on a behavioral level, on an emotional level, on a cognitive level. But now comes the 10th, and that is the superconscious. And this is where sometimes we need, on a healthy level, a song. We need to go back to our primal place, even before we remember something pure. It's almost going back into our mother's womb and connecting to things that we don't even have recollection of. The corruption of that is called the corruption of the firstborn, because the firstborn is the Kesers where everything began. But here we're talking superconscious, not the conscious. The difference is the conscious is something you can be aware of, you can relate to it. The superconscious is something you can't really touch. But it's critical, both if that gets corrupt, it's a lot worse than any form of corruption, because it's something you can't even hold on to. That is why child abuse, God forbid, and I say God forbid many times over, is the worst form of abuse, because you're going to a vulnerable, defenseless, innocent child and hurting that child on the superconscious level. So children, many don't even remember. And that is going into the very wiring of our essential self. That is on the corrupt level. The positive level is that when you're able to go to a place like that, and sometimes you need for that, you need faith, you need superconscious tools, not just conscious ones, not just emotional, behavioral ones. You need superconscious tools to be able to access that dimension, to be able to heal on that level. You definitely need strengths that are greater than we are. As we say, you need to be tied above, not to fall below. And the real healing is ultimately on that level, just as the deepest corruption is on that level as well. Now, as you can imagine, I was quite brief. There's so much more to be said. I hope this can be, you can unpack this, but please don't hesitate to write to me or write to us at Meaningful Life Center, meaningfullife.com. For more information on these, we could send it to you in writing. We could send you longer workshops on this topic. I really believe that if this was developed in the proper way, we have for ourselves really 10 building blocks of healing, as well as 10 building blocks of what corruption can be like. And they are counter forces. They counteract each other, and that's the goal, is to create the true healing that we can actually experience Yetzias Mitzrayim, to transcend our constraints, to transcend our dysfunctionalities and our limits and our fears, our inhibitions, addictions, and all the other unfortunate challenges that each of us face. I hope this was helpful in this Bible series of applying biblical principles, ideas, characters, events, narrative to our personal lives. This is Simon Jacobson. Always an honor to share and to communicate with you. And please share with others if you feel this was helpful. Love to hear your feedback, thoughts, comments, questions, suggestions for future programs. And everyone be well. Have a very happy New Year as we go into the new year, 2022. And please stay in touch. If you go to meaningfullife.com, you'll find a calendar full of events and different programs, different topics addressing different challenges, different issues. And we're here for you, and we appreciate your partnership with us. I also want to mention, as we conclude the year, we just ran a end of the year crowdfunding campaign. Thank you, very successful, and I want to thank everyone who's contributed to it. If you haven't and want to still contribute to it, you still have a chance to do so. It's tax deductible. And the end of the year, just go to giftofmeaning.com, giftofmeaning.com, and all your support is deeply appreciated. Thank you so much. Be well and be blessed.